All right, perfect. We're going to get started while the last few people grab their food and find their seats. Again, if front rows are still available, you won't block the presenters because they're up high. But yes, thank you for coming to this panel discussion for Earth Month. Earth Day was on Tuesday, in case you didn't know, and so we wanted to make sure that we took a look at addressing how cybersecurity is impacted by environmental changes. There we go. All right, so quick agenda and housekeeping. First off, if you need to use the bathroom, it is outside to the right, like the immediate door on the right through the big heavy doors. And then some reminders. If you are hiring or you're looking to sponsor one of these events, or if you're looking to volunteer or become a member, let us know. And there's several board members in the room today, so you can feel free to reach out to any of us. And then, so for upcoming events, we have a lot going on over the next couple of weeks. Obviously, RSA conference is next week. So if you're going to be up in San Francisco for that, and you want to meet up, there's a few of us in the room that are going to be up there. And then SANS is doing a workshop, so you can do your certifications here at the Manchester Grand Hyatt downtown, coming up May 5th through 10th. We can send it. We're going to send out an email with more information on that soon. But if you have any questions in the meantime, let us know. And then our next happy hour is already scheduled for Carl Strauss on May 14th at 5:30. I think it's slated for 5:30 to 8:30. You can always find this QR code takes you to this website, but our main website, sdissa.org, and then upcoming events. So that's your main go-to hub for anything ISSA. If anybody else needs to scan that before I move on. Good. All right. And then top 10 reasons, I'm not going to read these off, but obviously we put on a lot of fun events and educational events. This is going to be a really interesting panel today, very different from anything else I've seen out there. And then if you have questions about membership, Jelaine in the back is waving, you can reach out to her. And then again, our website's main hub. You can join our mailing list to make sure you're getting all of our updates, or follow us on LinkedIn or anywhere else, depending on where you choose to get your social updates. And then want to make sure we thank our sponsors. So first off, annual partner is Kela Threat Intel. And then our event sponsors for the year are listed here. So we've had a lot of good support from the community. And then I'm actually going to let Assured Data Protection come up and give you a little window into what they offer.
Thank you, sir. Hey guys, thank you. Man, that's an easy crowd. I haven't even had to say anything yet. I'm Wylan Mendez. I'm with Assured Data Protection. I'm our Southern California account executive, so I cover everything from Santa Barbara down here to San Diego. Used to be based in San Diego. Now I'm up in Rancho Cucamonga, unfortunately. But we are a backup and disaster recovery as a service organization, managed service provider. So the only thing we do is disaster recovery, hence why we are here today. We utilize a technology called Rubrik. If you guys are familiar with Rubrik, they are a very enterprise-grade backup technology solution. Their real claim to fame is in the cyber resiliency space, as well as in the natural disaster recovery, but they've never had a customer have to pay a ransom in a ransom attack. And for us on our end, we've also never had to have a customer pay a ransom, and we've never lost a gig of data in a recovery. So that's just a little bit about me. I will be over here if anyone has any questions, and thank you very much.
All right, so yeah, any questions, feel free to reach out. And yeah, we definitely wanted to try to align our sponsors today with the topic. So, and then just a quick view of, if you don't know who the board members are, we do have 3 committees, the Operation Committee, Engagement Committee, and Event Committee. So if you are looking to volunteer, those are committees that you can join without being having the full responsibility and accountability of being a board member. So let us know if you're interested in that. But in the room today, obviously myself, David Petco, and then we have Katie Hollebeck in the back row here, and Jillian Olds, which we right here, and Kristen is right there, and Geary is standing up in the back, and Sydney is right here in the middle. So if you have any questions about any of these positions or want to get involved, definitely reach out to us. And then for the main reason why we're all here today is the panel on climate change and cybersecurity. We're trying to look at how to build sustainable and resilient systems, and really looking at the intersection of the environment and cybersecurity, which doesn't get talked about a lot. I'm going to give each of the panelists the opportunity to introduce themselves, because they'll do a better job than I would. But Rick, why don't you start off?
Hello, everyone. Rick McElroy, currently CEO of Nextasure, a cybersecurity consulting firm that I started after leaving VMware. But I've been doing cybersecurity for about 26 years. I've built a bunch of programs in town. Used to work with Liesl back in the day. And yeah, thanks for having me.
Hi, I'm Liesl. I oversee InfoSec, so cyber risk and compliance for a small biotech in Detroit. I actually started my career at KPMG, so it's cool being back in the room. Like Rick said, with him at my last spot, where I also oversaw cyber at one point and many other third-party vendor management. I have a lot of different IT.
Hi there, I'm David Mufanish. I'm the CEO of Manchester Business Advisors. We do cybersecurity, a lot of HIPAA type scenarios. Background, I started my first programming company in 1984, and then got into IT management, CIO of healthcare organizations. I've also been the CEO of an international technology company with customers like Microsoft and a variety of others. So cybersecurity didn't exist when I started with this whole stuff. And for a long time, I was the guy that was in charge of it. And then I eventually started hiring people to do this. Shout out to Brett Rauschy, who is watching this remotely right now. I did that primarily at Manchester.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for being here today and passing back some knowledge to the community. So I don't think many people necessarily think of the environment when they think of cybersecurity as the first thing. But obviously, top of mind right now, I mean, we just had earthquakes in San Diego, we had the fires up in LA, and there's been a ton of flooding in the southeast, and also in the southwest. There's also been a lot of heat waves in Texas. So there's a lot of natural phenomena that are going on right now, and whether or not you believe in climate change, there's a lot of crazy weather that's happening. So the goal for today is really just to unpack the how environmental risks can actually compound cyber threats, especially when we're in an increasingly distributed workforce, leveraging cloud platforms, and there's a lot of aging infrastructure that's out there. So the first topic that along those lines that I want to talk about today is this new threat landscape that's coming about, and so we're seeing this climate change and accelerating of the physical threats, but then, like I mentioned, there's these compounding threats where there's opportunities where during a natural disaster, we can run into hackers taking advantage of that scenario and really bringing forth, adding insult to injury. And so, we're looking at what happens when the systems are already stressed, and even if people are already stressed in those scenarios. So, to start off, how have you guys seen the climate-related events that we talked about, expose vulnerabilities in your existing cybersecurity posture?
think they'll be able to hear us. We just talked about that with passing the mic. Yeah.
Can you hear?
The online guy.
The online.
Yeah, do it for the online.
Can you hear us? Yes. So just to start, I was actually at a NISACO conference last week and the CIO of LA spoke. So that was kind of cool to hear his perspective of dealing with the fires. And he talked about when he had spun up kind of the command and control center, they actually realized one of their data centers was in the middle of the fire exposed area. So it was an interesting intersection for him of having his IT people and incident response, but then also realizing he had to spin up a whole new data center somewhere else because that was where some critical infrastructure was. So it was interesting. Exactly. I told a couple of people I was doing a presentation on cyber and climate change. It's not related. Of course, everything's related. And that one was an interesting example.
Yeah, I think one of the first impacts people are noticing, major insurance groups across the globe have dropped cyber insurance. One, they're paying out too much money because they're really paying for all of the breaches. Secondarily, they quoted natural disasters and warfare as the reasons they can afford to take those risks on, right? So I would say there's a large manifestation as insurers are looking at the overall risk of those things happening. And then of course, where you put your data centers, that's a huge impact. And I'll give you like just a brief local example. I've been evacuated from my house and had an earthquake right around 10 o'clock in the morning in the same month. So as you can imagine, I'm a small business owner. I'm on with prospects and doing those things, and an earthquake happens or whatever the case may be, or we have to leave the house, which changes, my personal operations. So it does happen to manifest itself very locally, but I think those larger risks should be tracked. They should be accounted for your business. And frankly speaking, as risk advisors, as security advisors, we're going to have to account for a lot of that stuff and guide the business, especially around the nested supply chain and impacts all over the globe from disasters. So.
Yeah, I look at this way, right? Before you even get to climate change, let's start looking at the stuff that happened before, right? Before we get to climate change. We look at earthquakes, right? Has nothing to do with climate change, right? But in San Diego specifically, you have to look at earthquakes, right? So I was running the IT department for a pharmaceutical company here, and I looked at this and said, hey, they had everything local, even though there were offices in Philadelphia, there were offices in New Jersey and in Texas and other places. Why would you do that? So how do I make this convenient? I go to either Las Vegas or go to Phoenix, pick the PNAP in Phoenix. Well, this was actually, and it popped up on my phone yesterday. April 24th, I want to say was the date I was out there. It was 115 degrees in Phoenix, right? I talked with the manager of that center and said, what happens in this, if the power goes completely out? Oh, we have backup generators. Great, right? How long do they last? Well, we've got 2 weeks worth of diesel here, right? So you start going through this. Where is your diesel supply chain? He has in-state and out-of-state contracts, right? But it's just getting hotter, right? That's the climate change thing. So this date was April 24th, 2018. Have you noticed that it is getting hotter in San Diego too, right? And you can look at this. So climate change compounds the issues that we have, and we have to start looking at these vendors that much harder to see, can they actually deliver that when everything goes down?
Can I add that one up? Yeah. Puerto Rico recently went down. That was a solar storm. So that's like a good example of very brittle infrastructure. Unfortunately, in California, we have lots of power and utility. If you look at any of the projects to upgrade any of the power, or what the Department of Defense has done in the state to make their power more resilient, they've moved pretty quick to do that, but they're completely detached from our power grid. So it is a huge risk. It's why most of us, when we build data centers, don't put them here. We move them to Vegas, we move them to Phoenix, and we stick them in areas with low likelihoods of those disasters.
Yeah, and speaking of the heat waves and looking at more operational technology, like an HVAC system where do you see those being impacted by cybersecurity threats in natural disaster?
Target.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, everybody remember what happened to Target? If you don't, they had an HVAC system that they allowed a third party to come into. The third party then implanted some things, and Target was responsible for, at the time, the largest retail breach on the planet. And it was so big that Visa and MasterCard almost turned off their ability to process. Still hasn't happened. PCI DSS really hasn't been enforced. But yeah, that's just like one small example. Secondarily, I would say they are targeted by adversaries. So you go on the dark web right now, you can go have somebody build this malware for you or customize a specific piece of malware that's out there, specifically targeting PDUs, any of the power systems inside of a data center. And then lastly, I'll tell you, a very large manufacturer of hardware that happens to support lots of the AI on the planet had this happen. So a very destructive and kind of cool destructive attack if you're into those things. Someone went into their data center and took metal shavings and threw them in all the fans. Their entire data center to support the entire backend of AI and most of the hardware that goes with that was significantly impacted. So yeah, those things are all part of the chain that adversaries are going to do to really hit you in the Achilles heel.
We'll chat on it more later too, but that third party vendor management is exactly, that supply chain risk is huge.
The other piece that we need to start looking at is really, what's mission critical. In many companies, we look at this very myopic, right? It's like mission critical. I need this application, the rest of it I can put on paper. But what happens when your water system is attacked, right? What happens when you don't have generators? And let's face it, I've been lucky. Healthcare systems, most larger ones have the generators already there, right? You got a transfer switch, 12 seconds later, you're on power, right? And if these people really know what they're doing, they will have a local data center and they will have one somewhere else, right? But you still have risk there, right? What happens when your carrier only goes through one manhole, right? So there's some physical risks that go along with that. And think about it this way. When the natural disaster of some sort strikes, you're vulnerable already. And the bad guys will compound that, right? If they want to extract ransoms, how are they going to do this? They're going to hit you when you're at your weakest. And that's in a situation like that.
That's like jumping the gun for some of our next topics, but exactly that like we're saying, attackers are opportunistic, right? They see the news, and when something's in the news, they're reading those articles too. So exactly that is, like you mentioned, the critical infrastructure. There were the Florida water systems that were attacked, and I was thinking too about pandemic and some of these hurricane disasters where all of the insurance fraud and all of these claims come in. That attackers will capitalize on any and all opportunity. And then as I was thinking through this, it's the alarms and the detections are going off from a physical threat perspective. And depending on your resourcing and your bandwidth, are cyber attacks then lost in the mix when you're dealing with, just turning the lights back on or physical threats. So they really do compound.
Perfect. Yeah, and just to add on to the idea of getting a ransom, not even necessarily going the traditional route, but just impersonating federal officials or not incident response, but relief organizations, FEMA or something like that. Just low tech scams coming after your money when you're already like, somebody needs to help me, and ideally it's not that person.
It's like GoFundMe's and the phishing.
Yeah.
Just to give you an idea.
Yeah.
If I got to attack a company in California, and I know the big fire with the agitator, the CEO, the CPO, living out there, they will be so busy and worry about the plans.
Yeah.
But the company, so that will be the perfect time for me.
Yeah.
Yeah, we went
We're-
right?
Yes.
We worked at, Bridgeport, like when we had the massive fires in town.
Yeah.
And I mean, certainly it was all we could do to just make sure the employees were safe or at least communicated to from a C-level perspective. And then all of the testing operations that come with
all of it, right? And that was a particular challenge. So yes, I would tell you, as someone who's done lots of red teaming, it's a perfect time during an emergency to add some fuel to the fire or do a bunch of stuff that they're not going to notice. Because that's the other thing too, right? Like if I know you're distracted over here, I'm going to do a bunch of stuff over here that you just don't have time to deal with.
Control is gonna slip then, and, are people asking, so you say it's executives, are they gonna ask you to remove MFA or ask for, control exceptions because they want things to be quick and easy? Like, things slip through the cracks in those points and,
MGM,
yeah, exactly, the MGF breaches, there's, one of the recommendations, maybe I'll share it later, but, or give a little sneak preview now, is not wasting somebody else's crisis, right? Like, take those learning opportunities of the MGMs, the targets, and like, what can I do, learning from that downfall. But maybe we can jump to kind of the people point too.
That's actually my next topic.
Yeah, okay, perfect. Say I love to use the zombie apocalypse scenario, but like we're thinking about emergency response and like disaster plans and all of the people who are going to support work functions. And for me, it's like, let's be honest, like, can we pulse check, raise hands, who's going to come into work when it's zombie apocalypse? Like, it's not me, right? We're taking care of our kids or, dealing with family members or pets. So for me, I think there needs to be some realism and then maybe even like pessimism that, is this plan actually executable in a realistic manner for the people situation?
That's a great point. And just to cite what the U.S. government says about it, because I read all of these things. 1/3 of first responders, the U.S. military won't show up in the event of those types of true scenarios. So if you really think about that, that has a huge trickle-down effect, even to everything like, we saw this in LA, just getting around the city, people just abandon their cars, right? And so even your ability to get into a building to respond to something is going to be hampered. So I really like what Lisa finished with there, which is like, you can't just come up with a plan and not test it. You actually have to test it and go like, what are the probabilities that this type of scenario is going to actually happen? And are we covered in most of the likely cases to have a plan B or a plan C?
Let me take this a little bit further out, right? So we're sitting here in sunny San Diego and we're worrying about wildfires. There was, by the way, San Bernardino County just rang, there's a wildfire going up there. They have stopped 20 minutes ago. So thinking about that earthquake and so forth, right? Who here has operations, show of hands, on the East Coast? Do you think about their snow?
There's a major wildfire happening in Jersey right now.
Well, aside from that, but think about stuff like the wildfires back east are kind of newish things, right? But that's something that probably falls under the climate change category, right? But snow in Rochester, New York, or Buffalo, that's like an everyday type deal, right? They do that 7 months out of the year. So true story, Rochester Gas and Electric, right? These guys are, responsible for keeping the lights on. This is the 49th or 50th largest metro area in the country. And they got an ice storm and suddenly the whole area is out. Do they need their people in, their linemen and all this stuff? And they get linemen from all over the place. You know what part of their emergency response is? They have fleets, and don't make this up. They have fleets of snowmobiles, right? That they go out with and pick up their employees, regardless of what's going on, right? Now, if you're running a utility in the east and you're sitting here, is this on your radar? Are those kind of disasters on your radar? Yeah. When the hurricane hit in North Carolina, and I mentioned that in our conversation, right? One of the largest suppliers of IV bags in the United States was affected. Factory shut down and so forth, right? They couldn't even communicate that they weren't able to deliver IV bags, how many they had that could potentially be thrown out and so forth, right? We suddenly had a shortage. Over 80% of the IV bags are produced in a facility, or 6 facilities, all in the same local area, right? If their corporate headquarters is somewhere else, it's not on their radar. So you need to have those things on your radar as well.
That business process, I think.
One of the things, especially when you're talking about crisis, because I think about Katrina,
Where were the cops during Katrina? Well, nobody can take care of someone else. They can't take care of themselves.
Yeah.
And so I want this to lead into something that's not a crisis for the rest of the people in the room. Because as a cybersecurity manager, I think we all know how stressful, time consuming that job can be. So I want you to imagine a manager that steps back to an assistant manager position for his family life, everything else. And then within a year, the manager above him is replaced or quits 4 or 5 times. Well, who's taking that position over if that manager's not there? Well, it's the assistant manager. So now this assistant manager is getting less pay and still doing the same job he stepped back from to get away from. And so I had to pull him aside. I'd be like, well, this isn't your crisis, buddy. This is your company's crisis. You don't get profit share. So if you're going to ask for a raise, now's the time to do it. He's like, well, I did. And they said, well, let's get another guy in here and then we'll talk about it. And I said, why are you going to wait? If you wait till they get another guy in there, they're no longer in a crisis. So they're just going to tell you no. So you just tell them, hey, it's going to be this week or I'm out. And you'll see how quick you'll get that pay raise. So I just wanted to kind of throw that in there because this because the other thing for a lineman, if you're a lineman and they're telling you, hey, we're going to pay you the same amount we always pay you, when somebody's having to pull to your house in a snowmobile to come get you for work, no, that's hazard pay. Like you better be getting paid a premium or you're just not going to do it. What are they going to do? Fire you the next week when the blizzard's on? No, because the lines are all still torn down. I'm from the country. We used to get in the back. This is not a joke. We would load up cases of beer and cases of shotgun bird rounds, and we would drive down country roads and shoot the power lines with bird rounds. And the reason being is because it would knock the ice off the power lines. And the rounds are so small and the plastic so thick, it would wrap back around so the wires weren't exposed. So just imagine you're trying to get out and about in the country and you see a bunch of guys in the back of a truck with shotguns and little old ladies, I can kid you not, little old ladies would walk like 25, 50 yards out of their trailer home or home to come bring you a 6-pack or more shotgun shells because you're saving them from being blacked out.
I'm getting one.
Yeah. Something to say? Sorry.
Yeah, sorry about that. So in this data-driven economy, I mean, now all these risks, like resource coming to play, research and vulnerabilities, it's been kind of prediction, right? I mean, especially with the AI and things, and then that risk is already being tailored into the business to mitigate those risks, right? But I'm just trying to understand what is the real impact, especially with the climate change? Is it because of the human risk impact or the natural disasters or the nature disasters? Which one is kind of leading the risk factor in this data-driven economy?
Yeah, so I think the question is like, how do business see the risk of like, hey, we can predict certain storms. We know that things are cyclical, right? Versus kind of the impact of it, right? Like the impact of the business
exactly.
of climate change specifically.
Yeah, exactly. I think I want 2 examples where the cyber thing has actually related to the tech. I know one is in Germany, one is in United Healthcare CEOs thing, right? Where the guys were able to track where this guy is, even though he used to get all these text mails, and I mean, they were able to pinpoint where he's going and what he's doing and those kind of stuff, right? And then the other thing which happened was it happened probably around 2 years ago in Germany, where a lady has got a heart attack and then she was transported to the hospital, and then unfortunately there was a cyber attack and then a ransomware attack. They could not even get that, not do the extension prior to that. So I'm trying to understand here, like as we progress in the technology and the process and the enterprise risk management, which one is taking the lead here?
It's tough, and I would say it's very dependent on the vertical and very specific to, I would say, their place in that vertical. So, like as an example, I've worked with British Telecom and a bunch of the kind of big telecoms in the world. So if you look at like their trailing business risk, cyber is very low on that top 10. Like number 1 are things like pandemics, social unrest. Now, when I started to unpack that, like, oh, why is and this was well previous to the actual pandemic. Like, why is it on there? And they're like, we have thousands of people that get in vans and go into people's houses to fix things. That's a problem if there's a pandemic, right? Social unrest is an example, right? So if there's massive protests and riots that happen to impact power and they can't get the power back up, also a huge problem, right? So when those organizations, I think about it, they realistically pull in a bunch of actuary data, add that to risk modeling and intelligence, and try to make some decisions around that, right? And, you saw this in real time, kind of post the pandemic with someone like Abbott Labs, right? So Abbott Labs happens to be responsible for most of the baby formula in the country. Well, that was massively interrupted due to people not being able to go into, various factories across the United States. So they had done a good job distributing the work. However, when it was everyone impacted at once and we couldn't go to work, that becomes a major problem, right? So they took a significant, look at that risk and obviously made a boatload of investments and changes to make sure that that doesn't happen again. But lots of times as humans, we're just plain reactive, even in our personal lives, to something like a disaster. And I'll tell you how this impacts us here in San Diego. We forget. Like when it rains, like we forget the last time it rained and it flooded. I already forgot about it. Maybe the people in National City haven't. They're probably still impacted by that. But it's so nice all the time that we just get lulled into a kind of a false sense of security and risk.
Yeah. I think the vertical piece is really the key here, right? You look at healthcare, and again, I'm going to be talking healthcare until you guys are sick of it. But it was last year was the #1 attacked industry vertical worldwide. Why? Because people's lives are at risk. It's not just about the data. I mean, yeah, it is. Nobody wants to have their mental health records out there or whatever, right? Finland, they attacked the #1 mental health provider, and they blackmailed both the patients as well as the provider for personal data, right? So you have stuff like that. But you go back 2021 in Ireland, the Irish healthcare executive, I think is what it's called, was attacked, right? 2021 pandemic, right? The depths of it. And that was 100 million euros worth of damage. Not to mention hospitals shutting down, care delayed, surgeries delayed. We don't know how many people died, right? This stuff exists, and when you start thinking about it, how do you prepare for that, really? And how do you quantify this? I mean, as people responsible for that, how many times have you sat with someone in a room to try and justify your budget, right? And how many times are you being told, well, there seems to be an overlap over here. I Googled this, and why do you need 2 of that, right? Yeah, WebMD, right? Or, you Google your doctor's diagnosis, and effectively the same deal. That's really the problem. Sometimes people only learn from experience. They have to have seen this. So for us in the room, why do we know about Ireland, right? Why do we know about Germany or any of this stuff? It's because we have to proactively come up with the case studies that this stuff happened, right? And I went out when we talked about this from a climate change perspective, right, to try and Google, are there any examples out there that are directly related to this, right? The problem is they're not, because when Hurricane Sandy hit, nobody talked about this being a severe storm because of climate change. It was just a severe storm, right? How many people did they take from New York City and moved up to Binghamton and to places in upstate New York because the nursing homes were flooding? Nobody put the climate change stamp on this stuff, right? And that's really where our issue is with that, because we're still at the stage where we can quantify whether a storm, whether a fire, whether anything else, right, truly is due to climate change or because it just happened.
thought most of these attacks is not anymore kind of ransomware or certain type of attacks, but it's also the skills IT because most of the critical data that get in then the need is massive amount of data to train these models, especially in the healthcare because like synthetic data is very expensive, like because my client, my client has he sells it for 36 cents. That's not expensive. It is like when you go and see the hospital which is been providing services for hundreds and thousands of people, you get to millions of dollars, and it's been all sold in that output. I mean, this is kind of a case study right now. So that's another perspective.
Yeah. Well, a lot of this. Go ahead.
I just want to say, we've talked a lot about natural disasters and moved into the technology and started to touch on the people. I want to kind of bring all that together and talk about way of life attacks. We started to talk about, people not coming to work because of a natural disaster, but just in general, the way we live, food we eat, anything along those lines are, they're not just, sectors of our industry. They're things that we need to live day to day. So you guys could talk about some, your experience with that, the way of life attacks, or just how that's been planned into your cybersecurity posture.
Yeah, I mean, if you've ever sat with the FBI, that's what they'll tell you in the briefing is nation states are literally publishing that is their goal, is disrupting the American way of life, whether it's, sowing chaos from social media and bot interference, or it's exactly like we talked about, the Florida water disruption, the telco, I forget who's the meat vendor. I'm vegetarian, so I was sad about that one. But like meat disruption, right? Like it's literally these way of life things that I see that Julia Roberts movie that was a little doomsday, right? That's what the attackers are trying to do, and that's what they're targeting. And we're looking at these industrial systems that are very outdated from a cybersecurity perspective, unpatched. And to your point on big data, from a climate change perspective, we're very data reliant. So protecting these systems and harvesting the data from them while they're also very outdated, it's complicated.
Has anybody ever looked at how the trains in America work, especially from a cyber perspective? I got to, because we deployed a bunch of tech onto them. Talk about things that have been being pulled around since the 1950s in some cases. So never forget, the United States of America has the oldest infrastructure from an IT perspective. We don't turn things off very often. So we've got this legacy group of things that's been hanging around since the 80s and the 90s. I mean, look, we still go into shops and find NT boxes, and all kinds of versions of Windows. Sometimes they have red buttons attached to them. But look, it's a huge challenge. And as we're kind of racing towards this future, right, where we're just trusting some other thing to ingest all of this data, to your point, to take care of that, it becomes problematic. So look, I think to think about the people side of the resiliency, how do we address this as an industry? What we've done is we've gathered as much telemetry as humanly possible and then had to create the cloud to put it in there and actually do the analytics of all of the data we're capturing, right? So we created network detection and response, endpoint detection and response, intrusion detection systems, logging, event logging, all of this stuff has to be correlated. It's got to be put together. And ultimately, we've relied on very smart humans to do that, and we burn them out along the way. We've absolutely decimated this industry and not really cared about the people. I know senior people that are just leaving to do other jobs right now. It's kind of a shame, the state of the industry from a people resilience. So as you're building your technology, and you're building your programs, you can't do that on the backs of people. So you really have to think about automation first strategies. You have to think about employing agentic AI as it makes sense, and maybe in some cases for things like questions for your end user, something like language model. But you can't keep putting it on the back of the very few small number of people that actually know what's happening in the company. And in my humble opinion, I think leaders of programs themselves have been job chasing. It's pretty evident based on their amount of time in seats. It's generally 18 months to 3 years still for CISOs. So to have real resiliency and build a program, Like you gotta stay and put in some hard work up front. And you gotta know that your company's investing back in you and you know, doing the acceptable things that they're gonna need to. And look, this doesn't happen sometimes. Sometimes you find that what they hired you for is to check some check boxes. I have a gig like that. And then you go, hey, I'm not that person. Cool, it's time for me to move on. But if the company's investing in the technology, they can't spend all the money in the world. But if they have a good program, they're looking at the risk and actually fueling that with intelligence, and helping you by allowing you to bring in external teams to help in your programs. That's what's really going to make it, because at the end of the day, we probably, most of the people in this room have been through some sort of cyber emergency. And I can assure you, when you're quarterbacking that, when you're on a team trying to gather the data and you actually care, like 2.5 weeks later, you're just like, I didn't sleep for the last 2 days. It's crazy. And so teams are constantly under this. So I think as leaders, we got to stay in place. We got to have a strategy that accounts for the people. But we need amazing, smart people to be healthy and have good long careers. That was a long rant, sorry.
Well, I think it's a justified rant though, right? The other rant though is really from the top, right? How serious does the C-suite take this, right? Just because you have the C in CISO or in CIO does not mean that you have the internal pull to make some of the stuff happen, right? And part of that is in your arguments, when you go out, you need to show the probability of some of this stuff happening, right? And work off that. Sometimes that's not happening. It's like the stuff that's totally outside of the purview. So when we start looking at lifestyle attacks, for example, right? When we want to look at there's no water, there's no food, there's any of this, right? The first step is to really say, what are the options for us as this organization, whatever you do, whether you make lubricants or whether you run healthcare, right? What are our options to actually have impact on that? Yeah, and let's face it, some of the stuff is limited, right? Because what are you going to do? Stop all rice and beans for 30 years or something of that nature, right? That also, by the way, is against our lifestyle overall, right? So it's staying real, looking at your supply chain, looking at what is minimum necessary, right, to keep operating across verticals, right? And expanding cyber into physical security as well. Example to that, and this is a small example. So a good friend of mine, now retired, was the director of audit services for a very well-known university in Southern California. When he came on, he went and he observed that the physical security was rather lax. So he hired a white hacker, went out and had that dude break into the server room, right? Bypass all the physical security. These people have armed guards on site, on campus, right? He bypassed all of them, evaded every camera, went into the server room and walked out with 2 PCs, right? That was his proof that physical security had to be beefed up and had to be looked at. Before, when he said that, just sitting at the table, nobody took him serious, right? Now, Director of Audit Services is not someone that we would ordinarily look at and say, this guy knows something about cybersecurity, right? Find your partners. Find your partners, right? And start with low-hanging fruit. And that's where you build it from, because you can't boil the ocean. You can't start at the lifestyle.
Think about you you had a question and I knew you did too, so I don't want to forget about you. Like the term black swan, of a lot of the things, it's, you don't know something major is going to happen until it's a thing. You think it's not possible, right? Or we're just, oh, everything's fine. Oh, this will pass. Everything will, it'll fizzle out. A lot of times we don't anticipate these major incidents, or we're very heavily reliant, from a supply chain perspective. I think about like the AWS and the Microsofts of the world, and are you going to go spin up your own version of Microsoft? Like, no, right? So, a lot of these things, to your point, can you plan for and can you anticipate for? It becomes a risk benefit scenario where does the the risk justify cost expenditure and spinning up like a separate Google platform in case Microsoft goes down? Like, I want to make sure we answer both of your guys' questions.
Oh, no, you're good. I just wanted to kind of circle back to Rick, what you were saying about the social unrest and how that affects cyber. We actually have a really unique case study that is about that exactly. So back in 2020, when all the riots were going on across the whole country, one of our customers based out of Chicago, they're essentially the BevMo of Chicago, large liquor retail location, multiple stores. Their corner store location got looted during all the riots. And they were, for some reason, thought it was a good idea to host their data center out of a closet in that location. So their entire data center was essentially destroyed from that. And that data center controlled all of their POS systems for every location in the area. So luckily, they had disaster recovery through us and had all their data replicated to one of our clean rooms. And we ended up hosting their entire environment out of our data center for 3 months until they could rebuild a new data center that wasn't in the back of a liquor store. So
it's like the diversification, right? Of like geographically
Exactly,
distant, not putting all your eggs in the closet of in this basket.
Yeah.
In the closet. Yeah, that's so important. The redundancy of geodistance.
Yeah, so thank you. Rick, I want something you said brought up a question that I had about AI. Excuse me. So as it becomes more part of our everyday life, I heard that AI requires a huge amount of energy. So I'm wondering, like, is that something that we should be considering as cybersecurity professionals? Should we be mentioning this to clients looking to bring in AI into their systems, and what does that do with?
This is a great question. I love this question. There's a massive bottleneck between crypto mining and AI, and that's power. So here's how you know it's a problem. Imagine you're a data center engineer at Microsoft or Google, and you are tasked with like figuring out how to get around this obvious bottleneck in our energy supply system. And the answer that you come to your boss with is nuclear powered data centers. That tells me that that's the only option that's feasible, reasonable, and has speed to market to help us make sure that we can continue to feed the obvious beasts that we need to. So yeah, my friends and clients that do gas and oil investment tell me that natural gas is kind of going off right now because lots of energy for data centers is powered by natural gas. So that's great for them. But yeah, if we don't fix the power bottleneck, it's going to be a real problem in the next 5 years, like a substantial problem.
Until AI, please, thank you.
Just to give you,
Keep doing that so we can get there fast.
just to give you numbers, 2% of the energy production globally goes to AI data centers right now, 2%, right? That's an enormous amount. And an AI data center takes 20 times the electricity to run than a normal data center does. You think about this, right? And we're in the beginning of this. We're very much in the beginning, right? So something obviously got to give, right? Whether the nuclear option is really an option, we don't know, right? Because let's face it, right? It's the old NIMBY thing, right? Not in my backyard, right? Who wants nuclear power plant, right? In their backyard, right? Yeah.
0 states.
And I understand it, right? I get a kick out of driving up the 5, you know, seeing that plant sitting there, right? And seriously, you know, that plant is going to sit there in 150 years because of what it represents, right? And so putting more of them out there, I don't know whether it's going to happen because there has to be the will to do that regardless of what the need is.
Your question over there.
Yeah. So I was curious on all of your thoughts on like some of the budget cuts with CISA.
Yeah.
And if like that opens up opportunities for private companies to step in. And like continuing on from that, like what do you think the impact is? Do you think we should do like scenario training to prepare for black swans? What does that look like? Things that.
So off the bat, right? Could private companies step in? Maybe, right? The biggest issue I have there is standards. Very difficult enough when a government agency gets all the industry players together and says we need to develop standards to do X, right? takes years, half the time they don't play. All you have to do is look at what happened, again, takes us back to healthcare, interoperability standards for healthcare, right? They barely have one standard there, and they're already saying that's not good enough. We need to have another one, right? Now try an uncoordinated group of companies trying to do that, right? How's that going to work, right? To me, I think something will happen. There will be some attack, and suddenly someone is going to realize that they went too far. It's that old pendulum thing, right? I don't want to spend the money, right? They're going to come back and they're going to start refunding all those things.
Like for me, from the system perspective, it is concerning because that's diverting a lot of the resources that as a nation we were using to, combat cyber threats from other nation states. Like that puts us at a disadvantage from the cybersecurity perspective globally. And to your point on, private companies, we are a capitalistic society. So to get all of the public companies to work together for like the greater good of humanity, they're for profit, right? Like that's cute. Are they really going to do that just to help humanity? Let's be honest, probably not, because they have shareholders, they have stockholders, right? So I agree that what would it take to get humanity and society to work together for this collective good? I'm not sure, right? So certainly there's opportunity from a profit perspective, and could they fill certain needs? Yes. But I would suspect that it would be profit driven and not the let's bolster those old roads or this crappy little water plant that has updated tech.
Yeah, I would say largely, I'll only go so far with this rant. I would say largely that the cybersecurity industry has been remarkably hurt in the last 3 months. I have lots of friends that says it's a real problem. But here's what's going to wind up happening. The need for the jobs don't go away. They'll just shift to places like Booz Allen, places like Raytheon, and I used to work there. So it'll become more expensive to actually do these jobs in the end, and then probably never go back to public service. So at least in regards to sort of what's happened at CISA. Secondarily, I'll say, but also good news, right? So MITRE comes out and says, hey, we're defunding our work with CVE. Everybody freaks out, including myself, and make a big post. 24 hours later, the community responds to that, right? So not a private entity, like the actual cybersecurity community and a bunch of smart people have gotten together. And now everyone's maintaining copies and exchanging this information, which is really great because it's the backbone of all of our programs. Yeah.
But again,
Don't
it's,
you think
Well, Liz was trying to sell me.
there is management? There would be management
Right.
where they can maybe
Yeah, they did OS query too. They absolutely
Yeah,
did OS query to the community. That's great.
but I think the other piece here and to think about, is we're talking about this very US centric, right? And this stuff is not US centric, right? We have, well, not just climate change, but cybersecurity is not US centric, right? We just happen to have some of the biggest tech companies in the world in the United States, right? Which is why some of the stuff resides here. But, you start looking at tech investment, right? And the stuff that we do know is that Israel and Germany are putting billions and billions into cybersecurity, into tech, and so forth, right? What we're doing effectively with defunding these government agencies is shifting a lot of these kind of activities to those countries. And ultimately, they're going to carry the ball, and the ball is going to stay there. And we're losing talent, and we're losing some of the control that we have, right? Because someone is going to step up, right? They're just as much at risk. And if the stuff exists here, there was no incentive for them to do this. There's now incentive to do that, right? And I guarantee you, this is not going to be carried by the community for very long before one of those countries steps up and says, yeah, I'm going to do X, right? They have the resources to do it. They just were never incented to do it.
Yeah, So I love where this is going, and I think it's interesting to look at. I think if we take a step back and look at the people aspect that we were talking about, and think about, okay, if there's natural disaster and these people aren't coming into work, and who's going to do that work while to keep everything running, and kind of plays into where we're losing this talent to other countries and other things. But like, where are we? How can we set up alternative talent or like contracts? I know we do it with IRA retainers and things like that, but like just day-to-day things. If there's a disaster, it's not necessarily an incident. How can we build out those workflow pipelines for people to come in and help our organizations?
I think it comes back to like the third-party risk management program. And again, really evaluating your supply chain when you're doing, vendor onboarding or continuous vendor evaluations, really understanding what that looks like. Well, first, starting at a higher level of that, knowing your business processes, what would a critical disruption look like? What would the impact be? Knowing where the crown jewels are, right? And then looking at your third-party vendors of who is actually going to support this, really asking them those tough questions of, in X scenario, give them that scenario, tell me what would happen. Walk through that, almost kind of tabletop like, but have them play it out to you, have those commitments in the contract so that at least you have something to, try to hold accountable for, and then build contingencies and redundancies where, you have backup things.
Yeah, like one example that comes to mind is Colonial Pipeline, right? So why did they shut off their systems? They weren't ransomed. Oh, because they couldn't figure out who to bill. That's a crazy reason to shut off 100% of your systems. Like for me, I'm just like, yeah, who did the risk modeling on that? If I said like the entire way we ingest money in this company, like I have to turn like that, that's just a wild. They should have planned to be able to at least track how much energy was like. That's a wild one. So I think for them, obviously identified as part of an attack scenario, hey, we still need to be able to bill people and make sure that the bill is correct and that we're able to take money into the company. But if like that should have been identified well in front of them, probably like 5 or 10 years ago. But those are like the critical processes. But one of the ones that I think often happens incorrectly is like critical business communication. So yeah, and I'll use a cyber disaster as an example, right? So let's use an example that like you have a local regionalized issue. The adversaries are taking advantage of that by trying to fish all your employees and saying, hey, we're from HR. Click here to get your communications package or whatever, right? So now the adversaries are obviously trying to do what they're going to do in the event of the scenario, and you're just communicating via your regular email, and the adversaries know everything that you're talking about. So, like as an example, as a minimum, as a group of leaders in the company, what is your plan when your comms go down? Like that's a simple one to plan for. Like your telco goes down sometimes, right? Is that signal? Maybe if you're at the Pentagon, that's using these days. But yeah, maybe it's not, right? Maybe you go like we have, these phones that are on a different carrier. Like that was stuff that we saw in real time. It's like AT&T when everybody had Blackberries. This dates us a little bit. When everybody had Blackberries and there was a power outage in town, like AT&T was oversubscribed. It was massive. So like all business kind of in town kind of stopped because the entire BlackBerry network didn't work. So then you go like, yeah, but Verizon's working, so we pivot to iPhones and assume the risk of a couple of days of communication. Well, great, you should do that. But I think comms is generally where it starts to get messed up, and then you have people that start to panic and do things. So to your point, identify those key communication and really critical processes, peel back, and then do some scenarios like a tabletop. What would we do if this disappeared for a day? That's a good place to start.
Yeah, and if you have anything to add, you can. But one of the things we're talking about communications, cell phones. But you also look at how much we relied on remote work during the pandemic, and how does that go down in these rural areas? I mean, Charles brought up shooting the power lines with shotgun, but just Wi-Fi and connectivity in those areas and getting people to do work from home. How does that play into things?
I think some of these introduce cyber risk too. With thinking in the climate disaster scenario, if the work systems go down, all of a sudden they're forwarding sensitive data to their phone and using their phone, right? Or, sorry, David, can you, I had a train of thought and then I forgot what, remind me of your, the work from home scenarios. Remote work. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we're seeing that. Oh, the public Wi-Fi is what I was seeing. Sorry, it's appropriate. People don't have Wi-Fi connection. They're out in the middle of nowhere, or folks are traveling. If they can't get connectivity, they're using some sketchy public hotel Wi-Fi, and then that's introducing cyber risk as well. So thinking about all these connectivity mechanisms and then security that.
I mean, that some of this stuff should be, table stakes. It's bread and butter, right? Having VPNs and so forth, right? And again, healthcare, right? I have a hospital, I have a large nursing home with several hundred rooms and so forth, right? I have to have more than one carrier, sometimes more than two, right? More than one line through that manhole, because it doesn't help me if I have Verizon and AT&T putting that fiber through the same conduit, right? Like Northwest Airlines, where the entire call center was on one airline, and the guy with a shovel went down the road and cut through the T1 or whatever they had at the time coming in there, right? So think about it from a perspective, we do have some options today, right? Why do we have T-Mobile home internet out there now? Why do we have Verizon chasing that, right? Why is AT&T chasing that, right? And that's because they figured out that with 5G, you can do some of those type of things now, right? Have you figured this out, right? And have the people who fund these kind of things figured out that you need to give your people secured routers potentially. You may have to give them VPN access, right? Not just VPN to your company, but potentially a public VPN, a NordVPN, or some other brand name like that, right? That you can engage relatively inexpensive and make sure that people use this type of stuff, right? And again, part of the problem is companies are not used to having to harden the infrastructure. They don't want to spend the money, right? And you need to come up with the models around that. How much IP do you lose when something happens? Not just productivity needs, right? That's always poo-poo, right? But what are the long-term effects of breach?
I love your point on that. The first thing that came to mind when you said, providing personal, like say it's a NordVPN for someone's personal life, well, the company would never want to pay for that. But then you think about the cost savings if there was a breach, how that's kind of the communication to the executives of how, here's the worst case that could play out. Wouldn't you rather spend this money up front rather than hear the potential implications of the down the line? So that, communicating the business risk in a way that they can understand.
Just curious, like, how your thoughts with using AI for red team with whether it's budget cuts or the need for local governments or state governments to come up with a scenario training like black swan scenarios. I'd be interested in your thoughts. I read a little bit about Rick and I saw you did some CT stuff with DoD. You can't go into that too much, but I'm thinking that AI can maybe create something like scenario training for teams to use to mitigate certain risks and assess certain vulnerabilities. I don't know if you've seen that. What the role that AI has.
Yes, and I was actually talking to my red team guy about this just last week, a third-party provider. He said, I love it. It made my job so much easier. He wrote the AI tool and had access to everything because it could read. It had full like Azure AD access, could enumerate all the users, all the privilege permissions. It made his kind of discovery process super simple. So it's the how are we securing AI to not like if it's breached, making the hacker's life extremely easy.
Yes.
The DoD's wild. They plan for amazing scenarios. Sometimes you're like, what is this scenario that they plan for? But a lot of times they have gamers scenarios. There's companies in town that are already working on this, like the ability to go onto a battlefield, map all of the RF spectrums, determine who's giving orders, and then make sure that that thing stops giving drone orders, right? So I think the DoD has a fairly reasonable take on this, which is the future of warfare is going to be robots and AI on robots and AI. I think you can see this in real time in the Ukraine. One of the scenarios that really happened is, you have a lot of people in basements driving drones around attacking tanks. The Russians figure out how they're actually communicating with their drones. They knock that offline, and they decided to write completely anonymous AI that allows for target selection on its own. They're not the only country that's done that. I think Israel's done it. I think we've probably done it. I just haven't announced it. But from a corporation perspective, where the real advances are, and where I see people doing really cool things, is like, imagine you have a defensive tool that attacks itself. But that defensive tool is deployed on hundreds of thousands of endpoints or servers or whatever the case may be. So now you say, like, well, how many permeations, if this one endpoint can run 1,000 permeations of lateral movement on a Windows box, and I have hundreds of thousands of those doing those in real time, well, I'm actually in the future from an attack perspective, because if you look at like traditional red teams or attackers, they're going to change their tactics or procedures maybe 3 to 5 times a year. If they're a military unit, it's very rare. Like, they swap based on capabilities other people are. So I think that's truly interesting. And then lastly, what I'll say is, when you do see a lot of people designing, especially in the new training and awareness space, this is something that I actually entertained the idea of building something around. But it's really fascinating. Firefighters are starting to do this. Law enforcement's already starting to do it. Military units are already adopting it. So I think you will see safety programs, like especially for organizations that like move gas and stuff. They're already having to get there. So I think you'll see more realism in those scenarios. And certainly, I've probably on a short timeline, you'll see a scenario where people are wearing headsets going through that, like where it's a full virtualized environment inside of a corporation. I think that would actually be like slick to be able to do, like a tabletop in an immersive environment where stuff's breaking, is much better than like a paper exercise. Paper exercise is good, but that live fire, yeah, that live fire makes it.
Then another one, the thing of the cyber being because they are going to be data center and I'm thinking of home or connecting or can they're pretty much provided and it's highly stable connected to this on that and that's kind of really getting to where they're really get some job after I would think I think that's something to do and I trust me, no company has a playbook. What they're going to do with this cyber is not disaster for the client. I mean, that's a lot of in my book.
Yeah. So just to reiterate for the people online, the topic is IoTs or IoT devices and them being sensitive to natural disasters and other things. But it brings up another good point of there's opportunities in these sensors and these devices at rural places to maybe hit off that there is a disaster happening or something, so that the HQ is informed, like we were talking about before, of something that they wouldn't be aware of because it's on the other side of the country. So maybe talk about the benefits of that, and then also the negatives around IoT devices, critical vulnerabilities.
Yeah, let me start there. So when this first thing started, right, IoT was one of those terms with LSs, right? We kind of know it today, but I remember the first argument that I ever got into was I had a federal officer that was actually the head of physical security in the healthcare system where I was CIO. And he had control over cameras, right? When I was done with him, we had control over cameras because we just hacked into the damn thing. Because all of them had, default passwords and all of that stuff, right? And that was just that first generation of when they went from, traditional CCTV kind of cameras to IP cameras. What you do today is to secure this, and the unfortunate thing, not everybody does that. There are things that are called IoT firewalls, right? They're devices you stick on-prem, right? they typically have actually AI running behind it, right? That monitors specifically your IoT devices and locks them up, right? There's a company out of Atlanta, you know, all Georgia tech engineers. These guys are brilliant. They have several patents pending around this stuff right now that automatically goes out and analyzes traffic between these devices, what kind of devices they are, where that stuff comes from. And they can lock this thing down to the point of when they see something, they create instantly a new subnet, moves those devices over there without them losing the ability to talk to other stuff, right? 10 top hospitals in America right now are running their stuff because it is so new, right? The reality is we have IoT devices everywhere, right? They're in your home. Yeah, your refrigerator is probably an IoT device, right? Yeah, but you go across America, you find damn things everywhere, right? I mean, how many people want that home automation system? Hey, Alexa, do X, Y, Z, right? That's your IoT device. You just opened a big hole in your firewall, right? And for me, this is a question of awareness. Yeah. You have those things sitting in patient rooms, in hospitals, in nursing homes, and so forth, right? Their HIPAA data is being blurted out there and so forth, right? What are those folks doing to secure that, right? That's what you need to do, and that's where it starts, right? And you take it up there.
Yeah, San Diego is pretty cool. We do lots of green initiatives and stuff. So I think we were like one of the first cities to get smart city. But yeah, I think the big thing over the last year has really been the number of water sensors that we've plugged in all over the place. Parks, you know, golf, like all of the things, which is really good, right? Because it gives water management the actual data that they need to figure out, like, well, how often do you need to sprinkle the thing? Can we all save water? We need to do that. We're in the West. That's a no-brainer. So yeah, in those cases, you're like, well, that's a simple dumb device that only provides telemetry as a sensor. Sure, if an adversary can get to it, I guess they can mess with your fundamental data set. But you know, if they took over, say, 5,000 of them, it's like DDoS or some type of attack. But yeah, I think fundamentally we do need to shift with IoT because essentially what we've done with it is put in a DMZ model, which is what we did with the original internet. That kind of quite hasn't worked, right? And it is a challenge because they're basically it's a race to the bottom on the cheapest device. So it's a really cheap dumb device that doesn't even have a disk, or you know, you really can't install security tools on these things. So you kind of have to pick a line of debarkation and draw around and try to create a defensive zone. But it's a challenge. And then certainly each vertical is different. You know, again, not to go back to that analogy, but IoT in manufacturing is much different. OT in manufacturing much different than even inside a hospital. Hospitals are plugging in IoT all over the place. And as they should, like we should encourage innovation and research, in the healthcare field, but we got to usher that onto the network very safely.
So much of that prosperity comes to basically an aqua.
The other thing I was thinking about, even to your point earlier about the VPN connections for people and IoT devices, it's supporting folks with whether it's business needs or personal needs, because if you don't expand your perimeter, they will expand it for you. And you would rather it be within your control, within your knowledge, not shadow IT. So it's how do we enable securing these devices? Otherwise, folks will find a way, and they will just go back to do so.
So I was actually going to move into supply chain with the talk about people being the supply chain, and then also we're talking about leveraging cloud resources and distributed environments in the AWS outage. But it's interesting to look at IoT as a supply chain
and where they're being manufactured overseas. So there's risk there just in the hardware itself. Maybe kind of work backwards on that and walk through all those things.
Is it really possible to hire, let's say, router, which is manufactured in China, is it possible to kind of completely take control of it because it's
Yeah, I mean, it's a bet. I would say if you give security researchers enough interest and some money, like generally speaking, you see that at DEF CON a lot, right? Like every year. So if there's a wide enough distribution of that thing, someone has an interest in it. And I would say there's been no device that a human has created that has proved infallible to that model. Even if we do stuff like air gapping is now breaking down, right? People are able to do software-defined radio attacks, jump over air gap networks, or do something like take over a switch and a camera and then trickle the data out via Morse code on the lights on the switch because they've taken over the camera that's pointed at the switches, and then they can do that too. So maybe it's not a direct attack on the device if it is hardened, but I would assure you somewhere in that supply chain, it's probably probable. Now, one of the ones I point to that affect all of us, because we don't think about this in our supply chain. Where does your office order food? Well, I can tell you that the Russians figured out where the FBI home office in New York orders their food from, and then hacked that website, and then got access to sensitive FBI records via the credentials that they were able to do that while they were logging in. And so it's, again, an adversary is going to pay attention to how you do what you do, in addition to the tools that you use to do that, right? And that's the chain that they're going to try to take advantage of. So the other thing I'll say about the supply chain is most of us don't know who our third parties are. And I don't think anybody on the planet knows who their third parties are. And that is really your shared risk, right? And we've seen this. Look, I was at Carbon Black VMware when everyone else on the planet had an outage in AWS and we did too. Well, what does that mean when you're providing security to the US Senate? That becomes a major problem, right? So we have all kinds of agencies and all kinds of folks in the government all over the globe. And if your security solution becomes unavailable because of a shared risk inside of AWS, well, where do they make most of the innovation and startups? Like, what are they building on in security? It's AWS. It's the bad. I can assure you, I'm doing it. It's the fastest market. So, like, that's also a risk that all of the products that are fueled by the cloud, generally, if you walk them back, they're in the same cloud. And, that's a risk of just you being able to do mission critical security. Yeah, so I think get an idea of your major suppliers and then what their responsibilities are in the event of this stuff is something else that, we often miss as well.
Contractually.
Yeah, and then sometimes they have self-inflicted wounds. Take down infrastructure.
Again, this is a chain that you gotta follow, right? And I would suggest you start with simple stuff, right? Think about it this way. We just went through this with COVID, right? We had the harbor in LA couldn't take ships in. They couldn't unload them fast enough. They dropped all that stuff into the ocean and went somewhere else, right? How many of your Lenovo computers were on there? How many chips that should go into cars? Ford had 100,000 cars parked in parking lots and didn't have the chips to put into those things, right? Why do you think the Infrastructure Act was passed? They're building now chip factories, or they're preparing to build chip factories in Syracuse, New York, somewhere in Ohio, and a few other places, right? So why is that, right? That is because they finally realized this dependence on a national level, right? I mean, this has always been there. I mean, give you an example, right? I'm going to take that back to, anybody know Eastman Kodak? Know what that company was, right? They basically, they invented the iPhone cameras, right? They kept the IP on almost all of this stuff. They shelved it. They didn't use it. They continued building normal cameras, right? Film-based cameras. One of the last things that they did is they had these single-use cameras. Remember, you went to like CVS or someplace like that. They weren't disposable. right? Because I actually was CIO of a company that refurbished those things. Kodak only made money on that when you had 8 turnarounds of this, right? So guess what? In the early 2000s, like 2003, the then administration, Bush administration, changed the tax law. And it made it more profitable for Kodak to send those cameras to China to refurbish them there, right? Than to refurbish them right in their backyard. Aside from the fact that they lost 1,500 jobs was that thing in the US, right? They now added this round trip in there, right? Talk about supply chain that was funded by taxpayers, basically. It was actually 50 cents more per camera to do that, but because of the tax law, it got cheaper, right? Now, we are no longer producing these cameras or any other ones in the United States. That's why those chip factories have come back. You cannot control that, but you can take a look at and see where your stuff comes from, right? Someone else is building computers, right? Someone has forward, manufacturing companies where they get parts that they stock here. They may be able to produce for you, right? Take a look at those kind of things. If you need that, find those suppliers. Don't buy them from Alibaba, where it comes directly from China, because that's the first thing that breaks when something happens.
Even just talking about supply chains, it sounds overwhelming, right? And some of these things in general, it's hard to think about getting your hands around this whole big environment. And, for me, what's been helpful is, to the earlier point on not wasting someone else's crisis, you brought up the CrowdStrike scenario. My company was not affected, but best believe I went and said, what would I have done? What did my SOP look like? And I think using each, if you see something in the news each week, use that as a mini tabletop, and gradually that will help you from a supplier perspective to make meaningful progress over time. Because if you think about, boiling the whole ocean that is supply chain and IoT, it's very overwhelming. But I think when you can kind of chip away at your processes and understanding in general, that gives you something that you can do kind of progressively. Slightly on top.
Yeah, and lots of times what you're really doing is just getting someone to realize the thing they did before. When you're leading the tabletops, when you're doing that, it's like, well, what are the likely scenarios? And when you can make it real personal for an executive team, like a fire happened and it was last week, and you're in speaking to them about how, hey, here's the after action report on how we communicated with employees. Like, this is the lost productivity plus like all the other things that happened. So you really can make it personal for people. And so in regards to that, what I would say is I have a plan. I have a home plan. Our plan is we're either evacuating the fastest in town or we're going to squat in place, right? So that's kind of the likely things you can do with lots of people in freeways. But we actually did get evacuated during the fire, right? And so I was like, hey, I have a hunch in my head that it's like 20 minutes to evacuate the house with all of the things that we think are important. Not everything's important. And it was 35 minutes. So, we did a little bit of an after action. We were like, hey, we got to get the front closet set back up with things that are ready to evacuate. And we're a little bit faster to get in the car because now our neighborhood's it's under construction. And so it's terrible with just traffic and cars. So like those are things that you can do like in your personal life. And then lastly, I'll tell you, as a United States Marine, I believe in checklists. That checklists have served me quite well in my career too. So have that personal checklist. Like maybe you don't need a bug out man. Maybe you think that you do because you're in an area that's going to be blocked by cars. So think about the most likely scenarios here. It's going to be fire and it's going to be an earthquake, right? If you can prepare for those two and have some sort of reasonable plan, you're better off than thousands of other people who haven't done that. And you can bring that into your business and sort of take that same approach. Don't have to say, hey, everything's at risk at once. You go, this is the most risky and here's why we need to spend time on it. And if you do that education piece, then usually people come along.
There's overlap there too, right? So even when you think about some of the compliance and the regulatory requirements, a lot of them are having the same, what PCI requires is similar to what SOX requires, similar to what NIST requires. So very similarly, when you're disaster planning, whether it's at work or at home, some of these things will check those same boxes. We actually haven't brought up, do you guys remember when there was that power outage in San Diego in what, like 2011? We haven't even talked about that one yet. That was wild.
Sweated except for people who were smart, like our boss, who went to the data center and just kicked it in the AC while we were all sweating, offline data center. Yeah, and then I was like, oh, lesson learned. I should have remembered that our data center had a generator and had the ability to run AC because it was in the middle of August, I think. It was super hot. But yeah, I think my takeaway from that was it wasn't, when it first happened, San Diegans did what San Diegans do. We got home, people started, throwing barbecues at the park and stuff. But then like later that night, everyone was like, is it coming back on? You started to get that like little bit of a question, like, what if they don't get the power back? What if it's 3 days? Then all the food in your fridge starts to spoil and stuff, right? So the other thing I'll do is recommend a book to everyone. It's a really good book. It actually came out of a huge DoD study on what would happen if there was a massive solar flare that impacted the grid. But it's called 1 Second After. But the author does a really good job. He's got a follow-up to it. But from a personal life planning for your family perspective, I would say it's an excellent book, and it'll have some lessons for your business.
So I know we touched on the solar flare, and we also mentioned Puerto Rico.
Yes.
To give context to everybody, maybe talk about why.
Well, the magnetic poles are shifting. No, I mean, I'm a little bit of a weather geek now. It's been weird. Yeah, because I'm fascinated by things that we've applied a massive amount of sensors to. And so even our oceans, I mean, the number of sensors that we have across waterways and in the air it's pretty cool, right? So if you're geeking, you like data, you geek out with weather data. But yeah, look, sometimes the atmosphere gets thin. It's not the first time that we've had solar events, but we really haven't hardened the infrastructure, and every part after 1984 is susceptible to an EMP attack, right? And the other scenario is obviously someone launching a large nuclear weapon in the upper atmosphere is the other scenario that the DoD plans for. But I'm not that alarmist. However, there have been a number of rising solar events, and I think again the New York and Canadian power grid were impacted by that. I forget the year. It's like mid-2000s.
2004 or something like that is what that was. And it was that cascading failure that you had, right?
Yeah.
Somewhere in Ohio, someone didn't put the switch fast enough, and the entire East Coast went up. But we've had it on the West Coast too. I remember an event that I was sitting in the Phoenix airport, and power went out on the entire West Coast, and it was probably 1985 or something of that nature, right?
And physical attacks on infrastructure. So to your point, and there's a couple of cases up in NorCal. If you look into them, no one's been prosecuted. We don't know who actually shot up our power grid, but people are. And it seems to be a preferred way to do some hacktivism too. So you actually see this associated with political strife and obviously disagreements on both sides. But please do not take down our power grid. We all need that. And I don't want to go back to having to like get a knife on a stone for fire.
And that goes back to the wavelength attacks with power. I want to come back to cascading failures, but you had a question.
I wanted to ask this before, but there wasn't really a good way to frame it. Now you guys are power. So, with the power grid, I work for a senator in Orange County, and he was a big proponent of hydrogen energy. And yes, don't people sell cars and so forth. And with what you're talking about, the vulnerability of the power grid, I know electric cars are good for the environment, but I think that puts some more pressure on the grid. I think solar panels put more pressure on the grid next year. So if I'm wrong, let me know. But I was just wondering what hydrogen, cars hydrogen, how in general offer like diversification that would help protect the state of California from vulnerabilities associated.
I think the future is diversification, right? I mean, even when you look at this from a perspective of how we replace carbon-based power, right? We're already doing wind and solar, and the reason we use so much natural gas is because it replaced coal at a cleaner way, but again, finite, not sustainable, no matter what someone says. Hydrogen we can make, right? but that also has drawbacks. But I think there is a transitional period, right, where anything can work. I think the issue that I see is much more the question of monetization, right? If you start looking at this, I actually just installed solar in my house, right? And got a 3.2 kilowatt system sitting there, and it takes care of everything that I want, right? I have a battery behind it, and I'm going through the nonsense with SDG&E right now to get the what they call a permit to operate, right? SDG&E is not really happy about that rooftop solar out there. Why? They make money of providing electricity, right? They have no drawback. You start looking at this. Part of your bill is when Pacific Gas and Electric was found liable for all this nonsense on the fires up there. Who's paying for it? You do, I do, in our power bills, right? And this is a point way beyond cybersecurity and hardening of infrastructure and so forth, right? We are in many ways in a third or fourth industrial revolution right now, right? This has huge political changes. All you have to do is the way we talk to each other now, right? Because we have different ideas about stuff, right? There are huge social changes coming because the way to pay for things is going to be different. Just think about it from the perspective. 20 years ago, when you and I pulled up to a gas pump, the only difference between you and I was, if you drove a huge truck and I drove a smaller car, I paid less because I made a different choice than you did, right? If you drive a Tesla or a Nissan Leaf or whatever kind of an electrical car, you do not pay gas taxes, right? So who pays for the upkeep of the roads? So the proposal now is to switch this all over to, how do we, how many miles do we drive? I find this actually a fairly reasonable replacement, right? Now we can argue about how do you make that happen. But we already have the politicians out there fighting over this stuff, right? Oh, this isn't fair, it's about this, about that. No, it's 50% or 40% of the cars in California are going electric right now, right? Those 40% of people are not paying towards the upkeep of our infrastructure, right? And I'm not making a political point. All I'm making here is a point that stuff changes, and change is hard, right? And if you can make a case for hydrogen, someone is willing to produce this stuff, right? And you can get gas stations that will carry that, right? It's no different because we have to build an entire hydrogen infrastructure so that you can get us the cars. No different than having to put electrical charging stations all over the place, right? But diversification is a good thing.
Yeah, I just had like a clarifying question because this is outside of my expertise, but why would having solar put more pressure on the power grid? Because my understanding is that you have like a backup generator and then you can use solar to use that so that you have like, you need power, don't use that. So I guess I don't understand.
I think it was electric cars, right? Not to separate the solar power generation from grid, correct?
Well, that's why I said I could be wrong. But in general, I've heard one of the challenges with electric cars is that it puts a lot of stress on the power grid.
Okay, generally because everyone parks at the same time and plugs in at the same time.
But then like with solar panels, if you don't have a backup generator,
Yes.
because not everybody gets the backup.
Yeah.
Maybe that's too wrong. I could be wrong, but maybe.
No, you're not, right? And the way I look at it is like this. I have the same thing. I got solar in my house. I guarantee in like 20 years, when we look back, we're going to be like, we were just strapping these things on top of our houses. Like, it's not a very elegant solution. We could all agree. And actually, I would say ran ahead of, so the innovation ran ahead of the actual existing infrastructure, which is a problem that we still see, right? So the other bottleneck with energy right now is lithium. Does everybody know where that comes from on the planet? Yeah, not here. Largely not here. I mean, California is approved in the Salton Sea to, obviously start doing lithium extractions. But that's key to every single battery and the storage of all of the power. So now, if I'm understanding where we are in California, we're actually having a problem with storage. Like we're generating a boatload of power through diverse means, right? But now we can't store it. And so then that becomes, or sell it off, and that becomes a major problem, right? Because the production of it's a little higher than in other areas, like obviously cheaper in the bottom.
Let's talk about the worst stuff coming, right? We're talking, has anybody heard of Greenland and Canada lately? Right? So if we hear Greenland and Canada,
Just think
we hear the closest sources of this stuff.
Well, you can see that like quickly the semiconductors and power become a national security issue. Right? I mean, oil always has them, right? Trust me, as someone deployed to the Middle East multiple times, oil is clearly in our national security best interest. I think now semiconductors and energy overall has moved into that arena as well, which is why you see politicians fighting about it.
So we'll take one question, and then I'm going to shift into disaster recovery as we back up, or as we wrap up.
The one way that the solar panel will create a system though, it doesn't have to go transfer the power somewhere else.
Yeah.
So everybody's saying, well, why are we building these solar farms out in the middle of nowhere instead of just putting them with all the parking lots where they need to be? But going back to supply chain, also check out Hidden Layer for a team AI, whole company. And then moving on to supply chain. Supply chain, it's not just about the microchips. Yes, that's obviously the most intricate and sensitive thing to manipulate. But when you come to defense contractors, most, if not all, the parts have to be made domestically, and if not with somebody that we partner with. And then going back to your comments about the drones, what I thought was kind of funny is now they're going back to like tow rockets, where they're using fiber optic cables. So they've got a spool of fiber optic cable from the drone to the operator, so that way it can't be RF jammed. But going back to also the storage of power, they're going old school. They're talking about building towers with just weights. And then it takes the energy to get the weight up there, and then the weight creates power when it goes back
Using
down.
our water infrastructure, someone kind of mentioned as well, and using the existing water towers to essentially do pneumatic storage and generation, which is interesting. But that's 25 years in the future.
And then the other thing is that's terrifying is when he means shooting up the electro grid, he means that literally.
No, I mean like they
Because-
get rifles and
Yeah.
shoot up the transformers.
And so if you go out to rural areas, you may see on some of these transformers, they'll have security cameras. But these security cameras are worthless because people are shooting at them hundreds of yards away. And then there's another tactic, you can Google this, called the graphite grenade. And they use that to take these power systems out. But the problem is, you think, okay, great, no big deal. They're out in a couple of days, they take this part, they go over there to replace it. Well, the problem is these large transformers are in limited supply. So if they do a coordinated attack in enough places, they can actually black out a very large grid.
Do you have something like that?
I suggest that the next, get a sponsorship for drinks out, all this just become.
We're gonna bring it back.
We haven't started talking about micro nuclear generators yet either. Those mobile nuclear power generators.
But the AI data centers, we were talking about that earlier.
So to bring it back in, we started talking about cascading failures. So touch on that briefly and talk about how we can mitigate risk and look at disaster recovery and business continuity from that aspect and kind of work back through.
I think in today's world, it's really a question of geodiversification, right? Your backup should exist in multiple places, not just in one place, and it shouldn't be home, right? I mean, go back 25 years, right? We basically had the backup tapes in the room next door, right? But some of the concepts are also older concepts too, right? I don't know who remembers hierarchical data storage as a concept, right? This goes back to what DEC did with Alta Vista search engines and so forth, right? They had some stuff online, some stuff offline, and so forth. And if you think about it, that's really what we're talking about here today, too, right? If all of your backups are fully online, always accessible, they're going to be susceptible to ransomware attacks, encryption, all that stuff, right? So to avoid cascading failure, stick it in multiple data centers in multiple regions, figure out how to decouple it from online type scenarios, use multiple vendors, right? but also know what your data is, right? Data classification is part of that. Make sure you know what that data is, whether you need it, right? And so much of this stuff today is done just like, okay, stick it down the pipe, put it on block storage, the cheapest stuff you can get, and so forth. That is what makes you vulnerable, right? Classify that data, put only the stuff out there that you need, right? And find some way to bring it offline.
Here's a good scenario. You get ransomed as a company and you're like, cool, but we have backups. And you're like, you have backups because you're the person that drives the tapes to the secure storage facility. Except here's what the adversaries do. They phish your storage location as you, so they gain access to your credentials. They tell them to delete all the backups. So you tell your incident response team when they come in, cool, we have backups. We'll be online soon. And they say, are you sure that you have your backups? And then they go, yeah, we know we have that, we drove the tapes. Cool, get the backups. No more backups. And then they go, how could this happen? And it was like, well, you didn't even have a challenge passphrase. Like a simple thing, like this human on the other side knew that if I don't say this particular phrase, that it's not me, and they should not delete all my back. Like that's a crazy thing to just handle via email, right? So it's even thinking out a scenario like that. Like what would happen if and they are going to get access to your cloud backups, right? They target them first. But the offline backups, the immutable stuff, you just got to make sure that you're testing them every once in a while. And I think that's another area we generally fail a lot of companies for. It's just like they've never taken their tapes and tried to restore anything from them. They rely on NetApp snapshots, they rely on their cloud backups, but never go through the full oh shit, we gotta go get our tapes. Yeah, every once in a while, I'm not saying every month, once a year would be great. Go get some tapes and test them.
Do you have anything?
No, yes. I have a comment as well as a question. I think another notable thing about ransomware is we're seeing attackers now do double extortion or triple extortion. So even though backups can help with business continuity, your private data could still be amounts of threat as well from a compliance perspective. I guess my question for all of you is we talked a lot about the threats and risks that exist today. I'm wondering what steps you recommend that an organization start with. So is it a tabletop exercise? Is it, doing a business impact analysis, so understanding critical assets and going backwards from there, or is there enough stuff that you know?
I would start with the business impact analysis. So you need to know what you care about in order to then test it and secure it properly. So do you know, if you're a cybersecurity practitioner, what are you there to protect? What are the crowd tools? What are the things that facilitate use of the crowd? What are the key business processes? What are your key vendors? And then putting those to the test. So it's really knowing what do I care about to begin with, to then develop, methods to secure it, to then test those methods and so on.
Yeah. Our clientele is a lot of small, growing to medium businesses. And so it's interesting. They don't have a security team. So we just work with CEOs and that's been just really interesting to okay, well, how do I get in? How do I not get in a giant BIA exercise, but still get to the same place as quick as possible because we're billing them a lot of money an hour, and they don't want to. They know what we're doing. I know you're right. And so the game we play is well, how quick can we get to that business impact now? What are the key questions to ask a small or medium business owner? Now it gets much more complex as you scale this out to an enterprise like that. I think for most of the companies in town, we're not that huge, if you're not Qualcomm, right? So it's what is going to hurt your business if it's down, right? And then they go, oh, well, this, billing. Okay, well, great. That goes on the list. How long? What if it was down for a day? What if it was 2 days? What if it was 3 days? Would that actually hurt? And you can quickly, a lot, they're running the same process as most companies, right? It's an investment firm. They've got to onboard people and figure out and make sure that they're not embezzling money and those types of activities for the SEC. But generally, then it comes to, well, it's this key critical process that runs once a month. Well, that's the thing we need to build resiliency into, because the rest of it, you're telling me it's not really going to inhibit your business if you have to wait a day. So I'm not going to build them an enterprise class resiliency program, but the two things that will leak out their entire business, I'll make sure that they invest there, right? So I think that's how you can start to go, what are the things you actually care about the most, and what's going to cripple us as a company? You start with those, and then eventually you work your way through the rings where then it becomes low risk. It's probably not worth investing money into.
Very good, very good.
Well, sorry, somebody else, I think at first. Okay. I just wanted to add one piece. That's another kind of story we have from our end, from one of our customers, that revolves around kind of the traditional tape backups. They were utilizing Iron Mountain before they came to us, and they were hit with a ransom attack. It was a large online retailer. They were hit with a ransom attack on Black Friday, and
That's day.
yeah, exactly. So they
UPS used to get it on Christmas. Though.
Yeah, exactly. So they were hit with a ransom attack on Black Friday, and they called Iron Mountain. They're saying, "Oh, we've got these tapes. We're good. We got the backups. No big deal." Iron Mountain sends the truck. They get the tapes there. They plug the tapes in. Immediate reinfection. And the reason for that is in these ransom attacks, a lot of the time, if the bad actors get into your environment undetected, they'll live within your skin for sometimes 6 to 8 months before releasing that attack. So you're backing up them on your backups. So there's a lot of changes happening in the landscape. I know it's been around for a long time. Tape backups are really good.
That's a good point.
It's not like the availability, it can be almost like your various things. I think integrity is the number one, especially with the trend of cities are going to replace the people, right? And the correct, today I saw one article where some company has failed to can replace the one model, we can replace the AI. I mean, it's a bad thing for the industry, but the integrity is the number one thing we need to protect. And like you said, you don't know like what's the impact of data corruption.
Look, we can talk around this every single time, yeah. But what that really brings it back to is a lot of the basics, right? So are you using an administrative password to do the same, your day-to-day mundane stuff, right? How many of those passwords and credentials do you have? How do you handle privileged credentials in general inside your organization? Are you monitoring those kind of things, right? So is there a CM system that is really backed up? That's where AI can help if it's the right one, right? Are you monitoring the right process, right? How do those alarms get to you? Are you getting every alarm so that basically after a while, none of these alarms mean anything? Or do you really have, a hierarchy in this kind of stuff, right? Those are basic type scenarios. And we're all sitting here and saying, yeah, of course, we do this, but is that really true? Can you say that your help desk guy that has an administrative password because he's got to do X doesn't use that password to do everything because it's a pain in the hiney to log out and log back in with the privileged credential to do the one thing that he's supposed to do with his privileged credential, right? This is where we get bitten in the hiney every time. That's why Target got hit when we talked about this, because the third-party vendor came in to work on something, right? But the reality is that could have been one of our own people too, right?
I think we talked a lot about basics, and I think most of these conversations go back to the basics all the time as we try to impart knowledge. And I think it just gets exacerbated in these disaster scenarios. Good question.
I had a question. Hopefully I can formulate right, but it seems like we're heading towards a direction with certain solutions, kind of like zero trust. wanted to see if you guys can give us some pointers on or some input on what you guys think the local net search or architect.
I zero trust almost all the vendors that say they do zero trust because zero trust is not a product. In fact, I would say it's not even an architecture. If anything, it's like a guiding vision for your program, right? And it is achievable in certain areas of a security program. So I won't make the argument that like you can't achieve this from an endpoint perspective or multiple endpoints, or from a network perspective. However, the holistic deployment of zero trust has largely failed. And part of the reason is like we didn't even have fundamental telemetry, and so that had to be invented. The cloud kind of had to be invented so that we could actually do analytics to get to zero trust. So unless you're in like a pure prevention model for zero trust, it's again, you should march towards that, but at a certain point, you'll have diminishing returns. Now, what I will say about this is the largest area I see people miss is their identities. They do not manage them. They have all kinds of wild ass permissions and they're just logging in all over the place. And so I don't love what Microsoft's doing. So I want to be very clear about what they're doing in their next OS release for consumers. However, this backwards compatibility with Microsoft since the 90s is killing us. I mean, I can still run BBcats on any Windows box and get your credentials. That has to change. So fundamentally, the way our operating systems operate, Apple is obviously a bit different with that. Linux is obviously different with that. But Microsoft, by far, the biggest one. Can we stop with NTLM? Like passing the hash still works, and that's crazy to me. And I would have thought over 25 years that would have been absolutely addressed. So it's like, hey, what do we have to do to cover up all of these fundamental problems in an operating system? Most of programs are layered on top of a fundamentally flawed operating system. If we can get back to good design of operating systems, much harder to have an iPhone than it used to be when it originally came out. They've done an absolute amazing job, right? As far as I know, there's only one company on the planet that has commercial gear available to pop an iPhone. I would love if that were true for Windows boxes, right? So again, then you get into the complexity of 20, 25 solutions, 30 solutions to achieve the overarching goal of zero trust. And then you have all of the people to manage. Now your budget is massively bloated. Your controller's coming to you going, how are you spending all of it? Like, where is all of this money going? And if they haven't had a breach because you've mitigated that along the way, well, now they're really going to question your program. And so I think it is good. I think there are areas that you should shoot for zero trust, specifically around identity, and then just enable your other control around that. Like, draw the line around identity and spend a little less money else.
So, but you can add one thing, but as we come to a close here, because we're running up on time, I wanted to talk a little bit about, we mentioned there's a failure in scenario-based planning, that we're not doing enough of it, but how do we build systems that assume failure and quick backup, bouncing back from something that happens, and then, so do you want to start with what you were going to say?
Sure, the zero trust. I think it's with this tools you have in your tech stack, understanding like, first of all, what does zero trust mean to me? And then what's achievable within the tools that I have from the, like Rick said, technical capability to control perspective. And then by all means, whether it's user device, location based, IP address, like there's a ton of different ways to achieve it, but it's defining what does that mean.
And then in your answers to what I just brought up, if you want to wrap with anything that you think organizations should do in the next year to really make this shift, go ahead, add that on.
I think it's looking at the big picture. And like we were saying, it can sound very overwhelming to your point, like, do we all need a drink now? Like, it's a little intimidating. It's kind of doomsday, right? So it's like, what can I do with what I have from a time bandwidth perspective? Even talking about like alert fatigue and all of these incidents, we're dealing with day jobs. So, above and beyond that and thinking about these critical, like the black swan scenarios, it can be overwhelming. So for me, it's the, don't eat elephants, but like the one bite at a time situation, right? Like how much can I do today? Or if I set a goal of this is what I want it to look like, project management style, mapping it out of, let's do one thing a week and you'll get there eventually. So I think, setting reasonable expectations while, having goals and working toward it would help, from an overwhelm and perspective.
Yeah, I'm looking at this, maybe senior management got to me on that part because I was doing it for so long. It's that conversation around the overarching business risk. Yeah, what makes you lose the entire business, right? What will it take to do, right? And having those conversations without technical gobbledygook, right? Let's think about what we have talked about here today. Yeah, if you had anybody sitting here that didn't come from a tech background of some sort, right? What did they hear? Most of them wouldn't have understood half of what we're talking about, right? And we need to learn to speak English without using the words that we're using in the room, right? That's the only way you're going to get people to go along with that. And bringing the rest of these organizations along with you is the only way you're going to make this happen. You need the budget, you need the people, and you need the buy-in, right? You need to think about how you make that happen.
The more time you can spend on being persuasive as a leader, the better. Yeah, I mean, I'm a big believer in, you can tell people in the time, I don't like to anybody. Like, I mean, some people, right? But I really don't. Like, it's just in my DNA. I don't like when someone don't have to do something. So who does that, right? So like, why are we approaching leaders, other people in the company, as if we can just tell them what to do, and then they'll go, oh, I got it. I'm going to change my behavior that I've been literally doing for my entire life. That's not how people change their behavior, right? But I think if you look into being persuasive, I think if you try to make it very personal, other ways that we've affected change in organizations, get somebody besides yourself to present to these people. Bring in experts. There's tons of people in town that, will come into your company and just give your executives a talk. I'm calling the FBI. They're very good at what they do, especially the InfraGard members who are really, in charge of critical infrastructure, so they can speak to where San Diego is. We have every single piece of critical infrastructure in this town. They can speak to those threats. They can speak to literally the things they're seeing. And oh, by the way, never forget that executives have a Hollywood impression of us, right? So this is the lesson I learned when I got called up on a random day to the CEO's office. And I was like, we are not dressed to go up to the CEO's office. One of my teammates had just shaved his head into a mohawk. I think we were in flip-flops and hoodies. And I was like, this is really bad timing. We have a corporate dress policy. And I was told just to go up and tell them a great story. So I was like, well, I'm a pretty good storyteller. I'll tell them a great story. I told them the story of how I walked around this company for 3 days in a coffee cup and stole hundreds of thousands of Social Security numbers. And that's how I started the conversation. And once we shifted that, I could tell that he now thinks he has a Hollywood version of his own, hackers on his own team, and he trusts us implicitly. Like when we say, hey, this is something that we need to do. So if you understand the people that you're talking to and you understand how they relate to security, I think you can find a way to fit in there, and you're probably going to have to shift your style and how you speak about it. But if you can really work on that as you start to level up in your career and move off keyboard towards leading the programs, it's made the biggest change for my career. And it's just something I tell people to invest in. So yeah, the power of persuasion works for this too. We have to sell people on what we're doing. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, I really appreciate you guys giving your time. I just want to thank everybody for coming out first, and come to more of these sessions. We're going to keep, in addition to our fun events, our happy hours, we do a lot of these fun panels and really get into the weeds on these, not all doomsday scenarios, but just good quality.
It's a real scenario.
Yeah. And but yeah, so feel free to network after. But if anybody has other questions for the panel before we close.
Thank you guys. I have a question for your two. So when you do your global cyber security risk assessment for your company or clients, do you have like climate change specifically risk, or is it completely under the umbrella of like natural risk or something like that? And if yes, then how do you quantify this?
Yeah, so I would say it depends. Again, as companies approach like the top of Fortune 50, they invest way more resources in time on this. So normally I would say, if you ask me the percentage of it, say 85 to 90% of the time it goes under natural disasters. And you localize that for the headquarters and then their large supply chain partners. But I would say most of the time, and it also helps, it helps focus on the actual thing that's local to the area, not necessarily something people don't agree on necessarily with climate change, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, agreed. Does it literally say climate change? No. So like ESG has helped to like bring the terminology and the verbiage. You know, you made an excellent point earlier that, you know, all of these things, the fires, you know, I don't want to, what you said earlier, right? That, you know, that label is not being applied because perhaps there's not the data or there's not that direct correlation that like, if then this equals that, you know, that's just.
I think the real deal is this, right? Again, 50% of our society can't agree on very basic thing with the other 50%, right? And we want to go and we want to persuade people to do certain things, right? I'm not going to use the word climate change when I do this, right? I'm not going to use the word whatever it is, right? Talk to the point, to the localized disaster, right? To the hurricane, to the fire, to the earthquake, to whatever the heck it is, right? Because the underlying cause is totally immaterial to the mitigation of the problem, right? It's not my job to convince you that climate change is real or that, you know, we should be driving, you know, cars other than electric cars and so forth, right? Can we have personal opinions to that? Absolutely, right? But let's take those out of it and bring it to the facts, you know, like, what's that TV show? Is that facts, man, right?
That's an old one.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was like pretty nice.
It's a great point, though. It ties back to what Rick said about, you know, framing your language and knowing your audience and how you're shaping the conversation and neutrality while also, you know, having the risk-based mindset to get what you want. It's that strategic kind of how to communicate. Anyone else other questions or things you were hoping to hear today that maybe something you'd like us to cover and anything was missed? Appreciate you guys being here.
Great job there. We do have the room kind of until whenever, so feel free to network. I mean, karaoke, so yeah, don't stay for 2 hours, but yeah, we can network for as long as you guys want, and panelists can get some food finals.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.